Hello, and welcome to the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy. My name is Miranda EDITH SKLAROFF, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at Penn. I'm excited to discuss the book, The Prophet of Discontent, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Critique of Racial Capitalism with its authors, Professor Andrew Douglas from Morehouse College and Professor Jared LOGGINS from Amherst College. This event is part of the Andrea Mitchell Center's Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy series. Thank you to Dr. Jeff Green and Dr. Matt Roth for hosting us there. Our current moment, I should say, is one of particular crisis, from the ongoing pandemic that has intensified previous inequalities to the aftermath of the George Floyd Uprisings of the summer of 2020. King's diagnosis of the interlocking systems that uphold racism and capitalism provides crucial guidance for us today. Drawing on original research in Morehouse College's Martin Luther King Jr. collection, this book explores King's ideas about the welfare state and capitalism, the nation and imperialism, and the government and redistribution. The authors also give accounts of King's lasting influence and the lost promise of Black study, a call to turn back to the Black radical thinkers who simultaneously grasped the dire straits of struggle today while recommitting to world-making projects. Today, the three of us will discuss the book for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll open up the space to your own questions. You can ask your own question at any time during the talk, and we'll try to cover them as much as possible towards the end. We'll also share a link to buy the book itself in the chat. So welcome, Professors LOGGINS and Douglas. We're so happy to have you here. I think we'll just jump right into questions because there is so much material to go over. And sort of maybe the first one for us to cover is drawing from the subtitle of the book, but also one of the major important theoretical concepts in the book, which is the idea of racial capitalism. So this was most famously theorized by scholar Cedric Robinson. For those of us who may be less familiar with Robinson's work, what is racial capitalism and why is it so important for understanding King's work today?
All right, I guess I'll get us started here. First of all, thank you for having us. So as you point out in the question, Cedric Robinson anchors the book in a number of different ways, including his account of racial capitalism. It's a term that Robinson himself, ironically, does not spend a great deal of time sort of unpacking analytically in Black Marxism. What Robinson gives us instead is the historical setting for how the emergence of slavery, colonialism, expropriation, of racial subjects was already there in the context of emerging capitalist societies in Europe. And one sort of implication of this historical move is that by the time we get to New World slavery, we're not talking about the beginning of capitalism's racial politics, right? We're talking about its further development, right? The development and instantiation of new forms of subjectivities, right, to service the capitalist order. Underlying Robinson's historically situated project, though, is an analytical claim, which has been stated by a number of contemporary scholars, Ruthie Gilmore, Jody Melamed, a number of scholars who make the analytical claim that capitalism, that insofar as capitalism, or insofar as capital accumulates, and capital is only capital because it accumulates, or when it accumulates, it does so by moving through inequalities among human groups, by reproducing uneven wage differentials and wealth stratification, by dispossessing people of their land and commodifying and partitioning that land, and of course through imperial domination, particularly of the global South. And this is all racialized and in ways that require us, as Andrew and I suggest in the book, to expand Marxist thought, not to abandon it or dismiss it, but to expand Marxist thought. Particularly it requires us to expand the sort of idea or move beyond to some extent, the idea that this conventional Marxist analysis of nominally free wage labor as capitalism's condition of possibility. And so we must turn our attention to the racial capitalism, right? As Andrew and I do in the book, race was necessary not only for codifying New World slavery and colonialism, but for continuing to reproduce what Michael Dawson and Nancy Fraser recently referred to as capitalism's ongoing boundary struggles through the hidden abode of race. That's the language they use, including the violence deployed to manage surplus populations. King is sort of a key figure here to this conceptual story for a number of reasons. First, he recognized what he called the total pattern of economic exploitation. As he said, it was a system predicated on exploitation, prejudice, and poverty. This analysis, of course, is a subtext for the struggle with the Memphis sanitation workers, for example, in 1968, and for his solidarity with the Black working class and Black working class labor struggles throughout the 1960s. More generally, King saw how Black and Brown workers were subjected to different modes and levels of servitude and semi-servitude, which evaded conventional understandings of labor exploitation. And so what does he say in a number of speeches to labor unions? He says, we still have slavery covered up by certain niceties of complexity. This is King's way of trying to think through these different racialized levels of servitude and subjectivity that form the basis of what it means to be a Black, to be a member of the Black working class. The second thing here, and Andrew I'm sure you can elaborate more on this. The second thing is that, especially as King moved into the second phase of the Black freedom struggle, where he turned to organizing against the impoverishment of Black populations in the urban North, in places like Chicago and Newark. He also began to see how the riches, the capital accumulated in the imperial core and unevenly distributed amongst the populations within the imperial core was made possible by exacting violence and racially expropriating the lives, bodies, land on countries outside the imperial core. And so again, when Fraser and Dawson, they talk about the boundary struggles that form the kind of condition of possibility for capitalism, King resonates here, particularly as he's thinking about how racial expropriation is sort of central to the story.
Yeah, that was a great introduction to the concept. And the only thing I would add, and just maybe provide a little more context for this book, both of us are political theorists, and what we're trying to do is use this discourse around racial capitalism, which of course is a language that King didn't have, at his disposal during his time. This was language and discourse that has really found traction within the last couple of decades. But it's just such a useful conceptual framework and discourse to apply to King to kind of tease out some of the theoretical commitments that undergird his analysis and his vision for social and economic transformation. And so, the heart of our book is really a question of, what critical theory of capitalist society does King's vision presuppose? And we try to reconstruct that critical theory. And that requires us to fill in some gaps, to move beyond King and sort of, chase some threads that we sort of read into his work. But again, this sort of milieu of racial capitalist discourse is just so productive, for this kind of work.
Great. I think that actually segues nicely into another question I had for you, which is in one of your chapters in particular, you do some work to situate King in the context of critical theory. And so I wanted to sort of ask, what kind of understanding of King do we get by situating him in this context versus others, and how that might change some of the contemporary, maybe most familiar receptions of King we have today?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of aspects of this that maybe are worth trying to mention. I mean, one is, in a way, just sort of stylistically, methodologically, we are really trying to replicate an approach that Cedric Robinson takes in his own work. In his most famous book, Black Marxism: The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, he starts out by exposing the limitations of European radicalism, the limitations of the Marxist tradition and its sort of Enlightenment rationalism, in order to kind of clear the way for a recovery of the Black radical tradition. And we're trying to do something similar, tracing, kind of the development of King's work from its sort of scholastic academic origins, which are, firmly rooted in a kind of European, in King's case, theological education, but there's a lot of social theory there, but it's very Eurocentric, it's very Hegelian. He's reading Marx as well, trying to sort of situate his thinking vis-a-vis the Marxist tradition. And we're trying to the arc of the book is we sort of trace the ways in which he gets embedded in this sort of tradition of European radicalism, but then in various ways sort of exposes the limitations of that tradition as a means of articulating, conveying the Black radical tradition. And we really ultimately conclude the book by situating King more squarely in this Black radical tradition in ways that are very similar to how Robinson articulates that. So that's one aspect of it. Another is, insofar as we're trying to think about King's critique of capitalism, we're pushing back against certain readings of King that don't underscore his structural analyses, that foreground sort of his liberal idealism and don't pay attention to his more all-encompassing critique of capitalist structures and racist structures of domination. King described Hegel at one point. He said Hegel was his favorite philosopher. He spoke about how he was reading Marx. We may talk about this a little bit later, but we try to tease out, some of the dialectical aspects of his thinking and his work. And, part of this gives us a way of sort of capturing his emphasis on social totality, on systems, as opposed to just sort of focusing narrowly on factors or sort of particular aspects of how a social system, an economic mode of production kind of hangs together. We really try to foreground sort of the totality and sort of think through that in ways that resonate broadly with that kind of Hegelian critical theory tradition. So those are just a couple of ways in the book that we, have found some value in trying to recover, the critical theory aspects of King's work. Jared, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that's right. I would just elaborate a little bit on the point that you make about, King as situated in an intellectual tradition. I mean, he was an intellectual, right? He's reading Marx and Hegel, for example. He's reading, Christian theologians. And he's developing a kind of interesting kind of analysis in light of that. But he's not an intellectual towards scholastic ends, right? I think that's important to sort of stress. He's situated, he understands himself as a kind of intellectual, but toward the emancipatory potential of human life, right? And so he's always kind of thinking in concert with movement, with struggle. He's developing an analysis, a theoretical kind of viewpoint, right, through which to kind of build solidarity, to build movements. And this is, of course, as Andrew suggested, right, this is consistent with, the Black radical tradition, right? The Black radical tradition is about kind of building and sustaining struggle. It's about negating, right, the racial capitalist order, from below, which is not sort of first and foremost about developing theory as a kind of scholastic kind of enterprise. It's developing theory to build movements and sustain them, right? In order to build a new world. And we'll talk about, I'm sure, about the world making, but yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that I really love about this book is that it is very, I'm also a political theorist, so it's like, all my faves are there, but it's very, it is very heady, but it's always connected back to these really like sort of nice, clear examples of what's sort of going on in the world that actually really helps bring to life a lot of the sort of theoretical implications that you're making. And one of them is this idea that it's actually kind of hard for us to wrap our head around how King perceived and acted as a public intellectual, because under neoliberalism, we have sort of thought leaders, we have TED Talks. You can even see it in how King is often represented today in sort of one pithy quote from a much longer speech that's sort of taken out of context, but is supposed to give us sort of like this deep insight. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the difference between a thought leader and maybe a public intellectual. I don't know what exactly the term you would want to contrast with that, but and I think, Jared, you just got it sort of like the part of it, which is that, I think this is not to create, he was not trying to create the perfect political theory. He was trying to create an emancipatory movement that led to, to justice. So could you talk a little bit about that, and maybe a little bit about some adjustments in thinking of particularly King, but maybe other previous sort of public intellectuals that would help us understand them more in their context?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm partly ambivalent about the term public intellectual for reasons that have to do with my reading of Adolph Reed and the famous piece "What Are the Drums Saying, Booker," in which he kind of critiques public intellectualism as concerned, with kind of individual standing, with the kind of brand management. And so part of me wants to say that there is a way that public intellectualism is sort of, is a kind of artifact of the neoliberal kind of moment, right? And at the same time, I think that, someone like King or James Baldwin, right? They're invested in a kind of, sort of bearing public witness, which is not the same, which requires kind of being in solidarity with ordinary struggles. It's not quite the same as a kind of public intellectualism that is interested in, kind of building up one's own brand. The other way I would kind of come at this question is to sort of like, neoliberalism is anti-relational, right? It's not about community. It's not about solidarity. It's not about, kind of collective flourishing. It's about the competitive individual subject, or as Wendy Brown has said recently, right, the entrepreneurial self. It's about reproducing the entrepreneurial self, right? And this subject is reproduced, among other places, in institutions of higher learning, right? Those of us who go to college, we're conditioned to, to kind of reproduce this entrepreneurial subjectivity. And I think part of what King is trying to do in this kind of radical, kind of intellectual tradition, if we want to call it that, is that he's trying to, again, kind of building on this last question, he's thinking about a kind of critical theoretical enterprise that is emancipatory, right? If the thought leader in our contemporary, the thought leader, the TED Talk, if this is sort of, to the extent that this is sort of widely circulating in our own time, this has something to do with the kind of demise of like radical counterpublics, right? The kind of radical, formal, informal networks and institutions that were designed to kind of hold people in the context of movement to account for their views, for the strategies that they put on display, right? There was a kind of debate, deliberation, and critique that has gone missing, and that has something to do with the demise of the counterpublic because of state violence and repression, because of internal dissension and so forth. But the point is, is that, I think this is part of the work to think about how do we build kind of radical counterpublics to fortify radical critique, to fortify critique so that it's not sort of about, kind of reproducing this this kind of entrepreneurial kind of branded self or something like that.
Yeah, this is great. The only thing I would maybe add, this is just to build on what you said, Jared, is, the neoliberalism, I think, disavows, the collective social undergirdings, the relationality, right? I mean, that stuff is always there. It's just about disavowing that, right? I mean, we're always dependent upon others, on the labors of others, right? But it's about disavowing that in order to celebrate this sort of competitive entrepreneurial individual, the sort of bootstrapping sort of individual that King often spoke about. And I think one of the other sort of threads of the book, and we may get into this a little bit later when we talk about our concluding chapter on the history of the Black world, is this theme of Black study. So we're interested in a particular chapter that you asked this question about. We're thinking about what it takes to build a kind of Black radical counterpublic. And throughout the book, we talk about how part of that is sort of committing to this notion of Black study, which is collective, the social nature of thinking, grounding, building together with others. And, King, this is sorry, I got my 6-year-old is home, a little sick today, my apologies. I lost my train of thought there. If anything, King was about avowing the sociality, right? The interconnectedness, the inescapable network of mutuality, right? And in this way, he's a sort of antithesis to the kind of neoliberal ideologies of disavowing all of that we've become so familiar with. And the only other thing I'll say about this too is that I think the notion of the neoliberal thought leader is predicated on this kind of producer-consumer relation, right? Where the thought leader is, giving these sort of one-way TED Talks that are to be consumed by an audience, and it's really not about kind of space for collective grounding and exchanging ideas. I'm with Jared on my ambivalence about public intellectualism, but there's something in that sort of gets at a kind of dialogic give and take and a kind of communal nature of working through things together. And so all of that gets disavowed, under sort of the neoliberal ideas industry.
Could I follow up on this too? In the 4th chapter of the book, we kind of talk about, what Cedric Robinson has to say about King. And this is kind of one entry point through which we're kind of understanding King's relationship to the Black radical tradition. King, for example, doesn't appear in Black Marxism. But if we read Black movements in America, King does appear as part of this like give and take that is at the heart of what it means to kind of be a Black radical intellectual, and Robinson kind of talks about it. So if I may, I want to read this passage which we cite in the book, and again, this appears in Cedric Robinson's book, Black Movements in America. This is Robinson. He says, when King spoke, his speech rhythms and language conspired with beliefs, concepts, ideas, icons, insinuated into Black Christian consciousness for generations. He clarioned a call to action that was heard wherever Afro-Christians could be found. In this performance, he was less a person than a signature of a social and historical identity. King articulated a vision of a future but accessible utopia. And then Robinson goes on to say, the power of the movement came from the masses, from a century or two of their ancestors under acute distress, elaborating a vision of the future and how it might be attained. In King, they saw their own reflection, not their master, their own ambitions and not his dictates. So again, when we talk about the kind of flow of historical movement, we're not talking about an intellectual imparting wisdom onto the hapless masses, right? It's precisely the other way around. And King's kind of mobilizing, his organizing would be nothing without the masses of Black working class people who were developing on the ground an analysis that was negating in all kinds of ways the logic of racial capitalism.
Yeah, I think all of this has been really helpful reformulation of maybe how we think about leaders and social movements, but also leaders more broadly. The give and take, I think, was such a nice thing to add to, besides the sort of the way in which thought leader shows, maybe reveals more strongly the sort of the ideals of neoliberalism as these hyper successful entrepreneurial, alone, essentially always on the stage, speaking alone, thinking alone. And I think you see that a lot. I'll just add a lot in the academy too, of the idea of thinking alone being virtuosic and genius in a number of ways. So, I'm going to pivot to a question that's a little bit away from the book. I'm also going to ask, for folks who maybe came in a couple minutes late, if you have any questions, just put them in the Q&A. You can ask them at any time and we'll fold them in later. And then my slightly pivot question is that we're all political theorists, and I was remarking on this before. Political theorists don't collaborate with each other very much. It's been a disappointment of mine in coming to this field. But this is a collaborative work. And I would love if you could talk about how it developed and how you worked together, and a little bit more about that.
Take it away, Andrew.
You want me to take it away? All right. This was my first co-authored effort at co-authorship of any sort. I have come up, in this field working in isolation, as most of us do. But it's been really a welcome exercise in so many ways. I mean, the product is far better than anything I could have done on my own. Absolutely. I mean, just the process of, give and take, talking through things before we draft things up, sort of taking a stab at drafting something, then sending it over to, my comrade and having him rewrite it, and vice versa. We end up at I think a much better place. But, this, I should also say that, and in a way, based on, building on what we were getting at a minute ago about sort of the communal sort of nature of thinking, in the way that we try to sort of elaborate on how, the movement and the ideas that King gives expression to, that we try to capture in the book, are themselves a product of the movement, of a people in movement, sort of trying to avow that kind of social grounded sort of nature, the production of ideas and expressions and theories. We try to perform a certain allegiance to that aspect of knowledge production, in the writing of this book. And I think that's been a really wonderful experience to engage in that. But I should also add that, well, I don't know, before I jump into the next thing I want to say, which was maybe something about, the particular book series and the sort of connection to Morehouse College that this project sort of grew out of. But Jared, do you want to add anything to the writing process, or this question of, what it means to co-author as a political theorist, which is a rare thing indeed.
So I feel inclined to say that the way that we're encouraged to sort of think in isolation is a ruse. You read an acknowledgement section of any book, it becomes clear that that book is always already a kind of collective endeavor, right? There are all kinds of networks, informal networks of support, of dialogue, of discussion that are important to the practice of like, doing intellectual work. And so I think part of what Andrew and I do is to kind of like, we, on the one hand, we acknowledge that we want to demystify that conceit, right? By saying, kind of on the front end, like, yes, we're writing a book, we are writing in concert. It is a kind of give and take, a back and forth. We're revising each other's sentences and thinking. And the work is better for it. There is a kind of a sort of performative gesture toward collective scholarship that Andrew and I embrace in the book, and we kind of elaborate a little bit on this in that final chapter where we're talking about Black study and collective scholarship and that kind of thing. So I think part of what we were trying to part of what kind of unfolded in this co-authorship is this idea that intellectual work is a collective project, either on the front end or on the back end. We think about the sort of formal and informal networks that inform any intellectual project, right?
Yeah, and it's also a nice exercise in sort of checking your sort of ego. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but those of us who spend our lives obsessing over sentences, our precious little sentences, and they get butchered by somebody who's reading it and suggesting a different way of articulating it, and having to sort of accept that the other version is better than what we came up with. That's, I think, a useful and valuable exercise, both as a writer, but just as someone living in the world with other people. So I think all of that kind of resonates with the kind of real life work that King was doing, and just, well, I was going to say the greatest acknowledgments ever written was Walter Rodney's 1972 How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, where he stresses exactly this point about how this conceit that we are responsible individually for whatever we produce, we've just got to get rid of that. That even this notion that, I leaned on all of these people for all this help, but the problems are all my responsibility. The fault's all mine. He says that's bourgeois nonsense, right? Even that is a reflection of the, the sort of collective environment in which the project was written and revised and so forth. And so, so I don't know, Miranda, I don't want to necessarily say more about, the book series of which this is a part, but, this does have some origins at Morehouse College, where I teach, and where Jared once upon a time came through, and we've got this was part of a book series, the Morehouse College King Collection series on civil and human rights, and this was a project that Jared and I did not really set out to do. It wasn't something that we had been thinking about for a long time and wanted to do. It was sort of an opportunity for us to contribute to a series that we wanted to support. A series that my colleague at Morehouse, Vicki Crawford, who directs our Morehouse King Collection papers. We have a small portion of the King estate, the King Collection at Morehouse. And it's really an underutilized collection in a lot of ways. But a few years ago, its director, Vicki Crawford, established this book series with the University of Georgia Press. And, we were just at a point, Jared was actually, I think, still in grad school working on his dissertation, and I was sort of finishing one project and thinking about where I might go next. And, we started talking about contributing a short volume to the series. We just thought that to get a book like this out relatively quickly, given all the other commitments that we had, that a co-authorship would be useful in that regard. And I think it proved to be the case.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And the context of Morehouse College's collection, I think, is also super helpful for sort of understanding where the book is coming from and situated in its own way. We already have some audience questions, so I'm going to just ask a couple more to tease out a few things that I think are sort of really exciting about the book, and then we will shift to the Q&A. So one of my questions is, I'm gonna just jump to the final chapter, which has already come up, which looks at Vincent Harding and the Institute of the Black World. Can you give a little bit of context for Harding and the Institute, and why you chose to focus on this particular legacy of MLK, which does really seem to be tied to both your sort of analysis, but also maybe some of the normative claims of the book that you want to make at the end?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, part of what we, Andrew and I wanted to do was to think about, the title of that final chapter. We wanted to think about the afterlives of King's radical critique. Where does it live? How is it sustained? And what does it mean, historically speaking, for people who understood themselves to be in concert with the kind of radical analysis that King was developing to kind of continue that in the wake of his assassination. And we turn to IBW, the Institute of the Black World, in part because the IBW raises questions about the perils of building and sustaining Black radical institutions in the face of institutional systemic pressures to conform. So IBW, this is an organization that was founded by Harding in 1969 after a split with the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Center. The center had asked Harding after King's death to essentially be the intellectual steward of King's radical legacy for the center. And after all, why is Harding? Why Harding? Because Harding had, after all, he was a close confidant of King. He had helped to draft the Beyond Vietnam speech, arguably one of King's most consequential speeches, which he delivered in 1967. Harding, however, had different ideas about what keeping King's radical legacy, what keeping King's legacy alive entailed. He had different ideas in relationship to the Memorial Center, and so those disagreements, which had something to do with the kind of white philanthropists who were backing the King Center, they envisioned the King Memorial Center as a kind of benign, kind of defanged kind of place to do liberal multicultural education without kind of thinking about these sort of deeper structural kind of questions that King had been raising, particularly in the second phase, what King understood as the second phase. And so those disagreements led Harding and others, including Gerald McWhorter and Stephen Henderson, to found the IBW, the Institute of the Black World. It was a vibrant place. IBW is where Harding, published the landmark essay, The Vocation of the Black Scholar, which many folks will have heard of or have read. It's the place where C.L.R. James delivered the Black Jacobin lectures. Walter Rodney delivered Walter Rodney Speaks, sort of the volume there in the early 1970s. Sylvia Wynter intended to publish her landmark Black Metamorphosis book with the IBW press arm. This is a place that brought James and Grace Lee Boggs, Ella Baker, Ossie Davis, and a number of radical thinkers. It was a place of kind of radical scholarship. There were kind of community-oriented programs that IBW put on, political education programs and the like. IBW was sort of invested in Pan-African struggles of various sorts. And IBW, the other thing I'll say about IBW is it was the antithesis of this kind of the emergence of this sort of neoliberal think tank. So so in the book, we talk about the Joint Center for Economic and Political Studies. And this was a kind of think tank that was geared towards the kind of reproducing a kind of managerialism, right? That was reproducing, this sort of neoliberal ideas about, kind of the Black scholar as a kind of manager or a mediator between, Black masses and government, right? And IBW was the antithesis of this kind of neoliberal kind of model, right? It was a place of collective scholarship. It was a place of kind of radical. It was a radical that was about kind of reproducing and establishing a radical intellectual tradition. IBW was under constant surveillance by the FBI and the local police in Atlanta, pretty much for the entire duration of IBW's existence, from 1969 up until its closing in 1980. Their headquarters had been broken in and bombarded. They had struggled to secure adequate funding, and they shut down for good. And they shut down for good in 1980 at a time in which, right, what we needed was this kind of radical, Black radical, institution to kind of, as a kind of counter position to the kind of emergence of the brutal kind of neoliberal Reagan years. And so the other story that we're kind of telling in the book about IBW is that it kind of, on the one hand, it sort of reveals the difficulties of sustaining a kind of counter public space. But on the other hand, there is something imaginative and speculative about the Institute of the Black World. And that gets us, Andrew, you can talk a little bit about the Black study dimension, right? The kind of speculative dimensions of IBW.
Yeah, sure. Actually, the only points I would add here is, maybe this idea of Black studies is important because this is to be distinguished from Black studies, which is a more institutionalized, regimented, accredited sort of approach to building a curriculum within college or a university setting, for example. And one of the things that we discuss in that chapter is the struggles that Vincent Harding and other intellectuals had finding a home for the kind of work that they wanted to do within the established universities. And Vincent Harding, of course, was a professor of history at Spelman College, HBCU in Atlanta, from 1965 to 69. And when he was, working with King to sort of help craft many of the speeches, including, the famous 1967 anti-Vietnam War speech. He was at Spelman at that time, and along with a number of other academics in the Atlanta area HBCU community, they were trying to build Black studies programming and curriculum, but were not finding adequate support for that in those spaces, and felt that they had to break off and establish this, this autonomous institution, what became the Institute of the Black World. But of course, that institution ran up against all sorts of challenges, just keeping its doors open, raising money within a racial capitalist milieu, and everything that you have to do in order to sort of be viable within this space as an institution that is working to build intellectual, scholar, activist communities around the sorts of questions that they were concerned with, that King was concerned with. And so, I just wanted to just sort of stress that sort of tension between, the established universities and the sort of need to sort of maybe break out and experiment with other kinds of institutions that can nurture this work in a more radical way. And of course, the notion of Black study is really meant to sort of capture that kind of the modes of living and grounding and exchanging ideas and thoughts with one another in a kind of unofficial, unaccredited, a sort of way that doesn't just sort of serve the circuits of capital accumulation, right? In the way that so often that kind of work in university spaces gets sort of conscripted into credentialing, academic knowledge production, commodification and all the rest. And, of course, Harney and Moten in their book, The Undercommons, sort of elaborate this idea of Black study, which is the one we sort of pick up on and read back into the work that Harding and others were doing at the IBW, very deliberately in the spirit of the later King, right? Carrying on a legacy of his later work as a kind of scholar activist.
I was just going to say too, on Moten and Harney had this formulation they talk about that Black study demonstrates its uselessness as a biofuel for circuits of accumulation, which I think is an interesting way to sort of think about kind of the practice, a kind of intellectual practice that is not trying to kind of reproduce, as you say, right, the logic of accumulation, but is gesturing to something else. And Harding, often talked about, very much in the spirit of King, the beloved community as a kind of speculative, enterprise, as a kind of speculative thing that's gesturing to something else. And so I see IBW is very much kind of in that tradition, as Harding and others were clear about. Like, they were clear about kind of thinking and working in the tradition of the radical King, right? The sort of radical beloved community King.
Okay, wonderful. We're going to switch to audience questions because we have a ton of them. We're going to try to get through them all. I'm going to ask a short one that came from an anonymous attendee, which is also on the lost promise of Black study. So this question came in before we had this conversation, but I think it does have it, like, the sort of periodization of it. So when was the promise lost? Is that an ongoing loss? Can the promise be recovered? That ending of the promise recovered is me, but maybe just a little bit more about how you think of it as, like, is it a historical moment and like something that's repetitive? To talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we published in the Boston Review an adaptation of this final chapter, and the editors at Boston Review, great, I'm not calling them out in any way, that was their title for that piece, The Lost Promise of Black Study. It was not our title. I don't think either of us knew it was going to be the title of the piece until it was actually published. So we're distanced ourselves a little bit from this idea of the lost promise of Black study, but it captures something of this, spirit of what we're trying to do in the piece. And periodization, I don't know. I mean, obviously we're trying to sort of capture something about how, in the 50 years since King's death and the 40 plus years since IBW was experimenting with institution building and Black study in the way that they were, we've seen simply the consolidation of the neoliberal ideas industry and the academic industrial complex in ways that I think make it even more difficult in our time to imagine a kind of autonomous institution that could viably nurture this kind of radical world building critical work without itself being connected to the reproduction of racial capitalist empire. Simply by, again, just keeping the lights on, right? And acquiring the equipment that you need to sort of do the work, and how all that's sort of embedded in this global capitalist supply chain and financial networks and all the rest that we can't ever really escape from, and so I think that, so I don't know, Jared, do you want to sort of add anything there around sort of the periodization? I mean, I think we're just trying to sort of paint in broad strokes that, with this sort of neoliberalization of the university, we've moved, I think, in a way, we need to sort of keep, some semblance of a commitment to a more authentic, integral, Black study, in the way that we think the spirit of the IBW was attempting to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think this is all right. I was just going to say that, the work that is sort of thinking about the kind of periodization of the struggle that Black studies departments are kind of under from their rise in the late 1960s and 70s through the 80s and 90s that like work, like Joshua Myers is kind of thinking about this, Martha Biondi, and more recently there's a new book out, Abdul Al-Kalimat, which is thinking about the book is titled The History of Black Studies. That book is partly thinking about the demise or the challenges that Black Studies departments are up against. And then of course, as Andrew said, it kind of raises the question of the kind of institutional pressures that a kind of critique of the University of Racial Capitalism are under during this period, right? But I think Andrew, you're right about the kind of what we're interested in is the kind of larger, kind of broader conceptual story about the difficulties that Black studies and Black study sort of under during this period of what we might call kind of counterinsurgency, right? Where you have, right, the state and universities, which are, choking, defunding, defanging, Black studies as an institution. And then it's like, okay, well, what follows from that? Well, what follows from that in part is the kind of, the decimation of this critique, right? Of the various kinds of critiques of the kind of colonial neo-imperial world order, critiques of racial capitalism, critiques of radical critiques of political economy. So that's what's lost, right? To some extent, I mean, we talk in the book about we reference a lot Paperson's A Third University is Possible. That book is, I think, a really excellent one in terms of documenting the world, what they call the world making of the university. And so in the book, there are different levels of this kind of world making, right? There is the kind of the first world university, which is about reproducing the kind of, what they call the academic industrial complex, right? Commitment to brand expansion and accumulation of patent, publication, and prestige. And then there's the kind of second world, right? Which is where kind of Black studies, ethnic studies, the kind of second world university, the second world university, where you have Black and ethnic studies departments, which are trying to make a kind of good faith critique of, racial capitalism, of the university as a kind of accumulating enterprise. And yet part of the gesture that Andrew and I kind of point to or kind of make in the book is to kind of think about the third worlding, sort of third dimension of the university as a world making institution, which is to say, what does it mean, we can kind of think about in the form of a question, which is, what does it mean to build kind of intellectual spaces that are connected to world building, that are connected to struggles, and that is partly what we're trying to do. And IBW kind of highlights this kind of third world making kind of dimension of the university.
Thank you so much for that. We have a bunch of questions, so I'm going to broadly break them into questions about Robinson, questions that are more historically tied to King, and then questions about what we should do with all the information. So that's the order I'm going to go in. I'm going to try to get to everyone's questions, but I am going to bundle to get do a little bundling so that we can try to get to them all. So these are two questions about Robinson that comes from two different, well, actually, I have no idea if they're different, maybe the same, but maybe different anonymous attendees. Also, thank you for these. These are all great, thoughtful, and I think hopefully elucidating questions. So the first one is, perhaps due to my lack of intimate familiarity with Robinson, the notion of racial capitalism implies for me that there could be a non-racial capitalism, which I wonder about. Would a non-racial capitalism be acceptable to the authors and to King, who of course rejected communism, or not? And then my second The second Robinson question to maybe sort of bundle with that is that the panelists mentioned Robinson's rejection of Enlightenment rationalism. Depending on what that means, I wonder about King, who seems to have been partly convinced by the progress made in history as per Kant and Hegel, whom the panelists already hinted at. One might, for instance, recall King's line about the arc of history, or much more. Does King accept Robinson's critique of Enlightenment rationalism? Important to note that, of course, Robinson's critique does come after King. So this is going to be, I think, partially guesswork. And if not, what does this say about the relationship between King and Robinson? So I'll let you take on those heady Robinson questions together.
Okay, I'll take the first part of the question.
Yeah, there's a lot here. Go ahead. This is great. Thank you for these questions.
This is a good question. So the first part, so racial capital, just to put it quite simply, we can move on at the risk of kind of elaborating too much. Racial capitalism is capitalism, right? The whole point of kind of elaborating the racial part is precisely to do as Michael Dawson and Nancy Fraser, for example, have done, which is to kind of highlight what they call the hidden abode of race, right? The way that race is sort of forms a condition of possibility for capitalism's reproduction. So the point of highlighting, right, the kind of racial capitalism is to highlight what is already there. It's a way, Jody Melamed has talked recently about, racial capitalism as a kind of activist hermeneutic. What does that mean? That means that racial capitalism can actually help us understand the sites of struggle against it, right? It can help us clarify the areas, the ways in which we can struggle against capitalism, right? Whether we're talking about imperialism, whether we're talking about the logic of disposability, which kind of, which sort of starves and disinvests in communities of color, which kind of, reproduces the kind of the prison industrial complex, and so forth. Kind of locks and cages surplus.
Can you please turn that down right there?
So that's how we respond to that first part. I don't know if.
All right, we've got our third co-author here joining us. My apologies. Appreciate your
Is it
grace.
all over?
Not yet. During these COVID times, appreciate the grace. I think you captured the essence of the racial capitalism thesis there. This last part of this first question on King rejecting communism in strong terms, I actually want to suggest that if we look at the reasons for why King rejected communism, they're actually the same reasons why he rejects capitalism. What he rejects about communism is most significantly the state violence piece, right? This idea of a totalitarian state. And, as we think about the role of state violence under racial capitalism, it's imperialism, both domestically and in an international context. It's surveillance. Its emphasis on law and order. I mean, we just saw this procession of NYPD cops through the streets of Manhattan this weekend. I mean, it looked like something right out of sort of these images of totalitarianism in the 1930s. And so, this is what King is rejecting. When we get at sort of the ideas and the values that undergird communist theory, or socialism or democracy, however we want to sort of think about that. King is far less critical of that. In fact, he's a proponent of it, right? The egalitarianism, avowing the communal nature, the interconnected nature, avowing that sort of network of mutuality that undergirds life itself, right? So I just thought I think it's important that we sort of understand the nature of his critique of communism and also put it in context. I mean, he was this sort of figure that was thrust into this leadership mantle during the height of the Cold War, and that hemmed him into sort of framing things in certain kind of ways, and so I think it's important to keep all that in mind. Mm-hmm. This question about King's rationalism, one of the there's a thread of the book that really undergirds the King's ambivalence in a lot of ways. We have a chapter where we talk about the layered nature of King's political theory, the way in which he has this kind of state-centered conception of the political on the one hand, fighting for, building out of a welfare state that could kind of rein in the worst excesses of racial capitalism. But there's this other flank of his political imaginary that is not so easily circumscribed by this kind of state-centered conception of the political and these questions of how we want to be governed, that resonates with what Cedric Robinson calls the an anti-political, right, tradition, a communal sort of forms of sociality that are not reducible to kind of political state-centered sort of governance, right? And that's an ambivalence that never really gets resolved in King's work. And I say that because I think there's something similar in terms of his ambivalence toward what we might think of as sort of Western rationalism. He's a dialectical thinker who never gives up this idea that the tensions and contradictions we experience in the world are ultimately synthesized rationally, that they're always sort of circumscribed by this overarching commitment to kind of rational coherence or rational synthesis, right? And so that sort of legacy of the Enlightenment dialectical tradition King seems to carry with him throughout his work. But again, in these sort of gesturing towards something that exceeds the terms of Western rationality and its modes of governance. That's where we get these sort of glimpses of what Robinson calls, the Black radical tradition. And so I think the point is just that King is never fully comfortable with sort of legacies of European rationalism, however we might want to understand that. There's always something that exceeds it, that he's sort of grasping toward, and that he sees, the movement that he's a part of as grasping after. It's speculative. The notion of the beloved community is to be sort of considered as part of this kind of speculative grasping after something that exceeds that kind of rational hold, right? So I don't know if this is a satisfying response. I mean, in some ways, King is just not an ultimately satisfying figure here. But I think we have to sit with him in that kind of space of undecidability or ambivalence. It's a great question, and I realize that response is not adequate to the depth of the question, but.
I think we're going to try to do a couple of historical questions and then move back. So our first question is from Richard. As a native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania's predominantly Black community, I'm interested if you can elaborate on the impact of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's march in Pittsburgh for the sanitation workers in the Hill District community. And this seems to get to a question that I didn't get a chance to ask, which is like, you are tracing some sort of developments in King's political theory of political economy over time in his life and over the course of the book, and maybe this particular event can also speak a little bit to that too as well.
So the question in Pittsburgh, I'll just out myself here. I mean, I'm a theorist, and part of the reason why I'm a theorist is because my brain doesn't work like a historian's might. So it's a thin book, we're doing some sort of theoretical work rather than sort of delving into all of the kind of historical details of King's life and the movement around him. And so I just don't sort of know a whole lot about King's involvement in Pittsburgh. But this is an opportunity, I think, since the question mentions sanitation workers. Of course, he's well known for his support of the Memphis sanitation workers strike, which of course is where he was assassinated in April of '68. And I think it's just an opportunity to stress King's ties to the labor movement, his support of progressive unionism, which I think is a struggle that in our present moment is as fundamental as it can be. And so I just want to use this opportunity to encourage folks to read King's work on his writings and speeches to labor audiences. There's a great volume edited by Michael Honey, a collection of his speeches to labor union audiences. And these are some of his best speeches, in my opinion, as well as a book that Michael Honey just came out with called To the Promised Land, that really traces King's connections to the labor movement. And the second, what was the second part of that one again? I'm sorry.
Oh, I think you covered it.
Okay.
There's another question that is specifically about the relationship between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Do you agree / think that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. intellectually crashed, collide, or merge in a robust academic challenge? I do think that like the sort of thinking through with the racial capitalist critic of racial capitalist lens, I should say, does sort of resituate these figures in various ways, but I'll let you speak to that.
I mean, the interesting thing about I think we cite Malcolm X in the introduction, in which he says in a way that King never quite said as explicitly, which is you can't have racism without capitalism. That was in a speech in 1964, I believe. I tend to think that the kind of historical feud between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King has been kind of oversimplified and reduced in some really unhelpful ways on a number of different. And the implication is that we're that there are a number of different ways in which King has more sort of nuanced views, in which they both have more nuanced views on a number of different questions, including the question of violence. And at the very beginning of the book, there's a kind of an introduction in which in the introduction we talk about King in Newark. He had been there. This is a week before he's assassinated. He is there with Amiri Baraka, Stanley Levinson, and several other confidants. And earlier, in the day, King had spent time with Baraka. He had kind of toured around Newark, and they had both kind of talked about the kind of pressure cooker-like conditions that kind of the young, more militant contingent there had been kind of experiencing. And there was a way in which those young people were sort of, again, they were engaging in more militant tactics. And what does King say about that contingent? He says, he shares with several confidants that he wholly sympathizes with what they feel, right? That he understands the conditions under which they're living. And he goes on to say that capitalism, cannot permit the even flow of economic resources. And so because the system will not change on its own, we're going to have to change the system. Right. And this kind of formulation actually poses, I think, a challenge to this sort of oversimplified kind of idea as King nonviolent, Malcolm X violent. Right. Because here we see, right, here's a King as he's thinking about the kind of conditions of racial capitalism that produce a kind of desperation and misery. King wants to say that, okay, well, that we need to deal with the conditions that produce that.
Andrew, did you want to add anything? We were just talking about how to think about the relationship between MLK and Malcolm X.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I have anything. I was listening to all of that. I'm not sure I have anything to add. I think Jared hit on some important points.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to turn to a couple of sort of forward-facing now questions about what we should do with everything we've learned from your wonderful book, or maybe how we should think about other things. This question is from Alyssa. Fascinating discussion, and thank you all. If King were alive today, given our current political and social environment, would he have been more aggressive in his teachings? Also, an off-topic note about how much Alyssa notices and likes your old school albums on the back of your wall, Jared. Wanted to also communicate that. But anyway, this is again maybe an exercise in guesswork, but what kind of insights do you think that we could think of him having today, or what approaches?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I always struggle with these. I mean, I appreciate these questions. The type of question that asks, if a historical figure were still around today, what might they say? And in a way, that's what our book is trying to make an argument about. Not so much if he were here, what he would say, but what lessons can be applied today from out of the teachings that we get from him. But I always kind of struggle with these questions. I mean, what's clear to me, well, Jared, what were you going to say? I'm curious.
I mean, I was going to say that, I mean, the question is, what can we say?
Yeah.
Right? What can we do? I mean, yes, King is an ancestor on which we can draw wisdom about the kind of ongoing struggles of racial capitalism. But the real question is, what are we going to do? Right? How are we going to respond to a kind of a system that depends on the logic of disposability, right? That locks up and cages people as a matter of course, right? To deal with the kind of surplus populations that are produced under capitalism. How are we going to deal with that? How are we going to deal with kind of the ongoing problem of imperialism, right? The way that the U.S. continues to be engaged with occupation of various kinds, right? How are we going to deal with that? To me, what King offers us is a set of, on the one hand, conceptual resources, but also a kind of ongoing call to do something, right? To be discontented about the conditions under which we live, under which so many people continue to live in misery and deprivation. So I'm inclined to kind of pivot or redirect to say that. I don't think it's necessary for us to try and recover or to try and project King in a certain kind of way in order to say like, okay, well, King would respond to the present in this way or that way. The real question is a more immediate political question for us.
Good answer. Thanks.
So there is another question from the audience from an anonymous attendee, which I think builds on this, which is clearly your collaborative intellectual theories are illuminating and thought-provoking. Is there any desire and effort to move your ideas from discussion to application and implementation to uplift the underserved minority communities? So I think that this is, again, a sort of question that tries to get at what kind of political practices come out of these, of this sort of new focus, new reading, new contextualization of King, maybe specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an academic. I don't consider myself an activist or an organizer, and so I sort of try to think about, what we can do in the classroom space with students who come in front of me. But I mean, I think the movements today that strike me as holding some real promise and aligning quite well with the spirit of King as we try to articulate in this book are, on the one hand, sort of abolitionist struggles broadly conceived. I just think that there's a certain radical world transformation, a radical rejection of existing institutions and radically imaginative work of building new institutions that can facilitate new ways of living and being in the world together, that are really at the heart of King's work. And I see a lot of resonance with, the kind of critical and imaginative spirit that we see today under sort of the banner broadly again of kind of abolitionist struggle. And the other is sort of the resurgence of organizing work and activism and sympathy and imagination around unions and the labor movement, and building worker power, which I think is such a crucial dimension of King's work that tends to get backgrounded in the kind of mainstream caricatures of King as a civil rights figure, right? And over time, we've sort of disaggregated the civil rights struggle and racial justice struggles from labor struggles in ways that have been really problematic. But I think the resurgence, unfortunately, due to the horrifying nature of work and conditions of life for so many people, have really thrust some of these questions about labor to the forefront in ways that I think create an opening to draw some meaningful connections with King's work as we try to articulate it in the book. Jared, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I was just going to say one thing about the language of uplift. It's, you know, both of us, you know, we work in the tradition of Black political thought. Kind of think about the kind of long trajectory of uplift, right, as a kind of as a term that has often been used as a way of expressing contempt for those who cannot sort of develop their own kind of political analysis, their own kind of critical political analysis, right? And I'm suspicious of that term. What is, the question wasn't into how do we uplift, marginalized persons or something like that. I mean, I think the real question to me is like, what is it? How do we sort of fortify and build on the pre-existing analysis that people have already intimately of the conditions under which they live, right? And that's not a question about uplift. That's not about uplift. That's about like how do we kind of support that work? How do we build movements? How do we organize people? Which is different from the question of uplift. So that's all I would say about that.
Okay, thank you. I thought that those were great answers. And we're going to move back to something that it sounds that's a little bit more theoretical, with a question from Ryan, who says, thank you, Andrew and Jared, for your work and for your insight. I'm thinking about Robin D.G. Kelley's comment in the foreword of Black Marxism. He reemphasizes how Robinson's point of the book was to not exhaust the tradition, but to point out it was there and how the Black radical tradition is not a greatest hits list. As someone who is interested in doing similar work as you two, I was specifically wondering how you might respond to Kelley's comment here. More specifically, is there room to engage other thinkers, Black thinkers' critiques of racial capitalism, or is there a limitation to the endeavor insofar that one might exhaust the subject?
Mm-hmm. So I think the question really is a question about the Black radical tradition, or rather, to understand the question, to really answer it, we have to know something about what Robinson means by the Black radical tradition. The Black radical tradition is not, like a sort of greatest hits of Black radical intellectuals. It's interesting because, in the book, Robinson, and especially in the second half of the book, he kind of uses, C.L.R. James, Richard Wright, Du Bois, Cox, and so forth as sort of like signposts, so to speak. But the point of the Black radical tradition is not about the intellectuals, right? It is not about the intellectuals. It is about a flow of historical movement, emancipatory movement, right? Insofar as there are intellectuals who are a part of the Black radical tradition, they are, as Robinson says, renegades, right? Renegades against what? Renegades against, their class interests as bourgeois, middle class intellectuals, right? And he says that they're renegades, and he goes on to say that the genius of these intellectuals, he's talking of James and Wright and Du Bois, the genius of these intellectuals is derivative. the real genius, the truer genius, as he puts it, right, is among the masses, is among the people. So what Robinson was trying to do in his understanding of the Black radical tradition was to kind of think past or think beyond the sort of way that a certain kind of intellectualism or scholasticism is the kind of conventional way in which, sort of intellectualism is understood as like, a group of men, mostly men, right, who are, uplifting or imparting wisdom and knowledge onto hapless masses. He wants to challenge this. On the one hand, because empirically speaking, it's not how it worked. Historically, it's not how it worked, right? And so what he was trying to do was to show that that there is a kind of radical tradition that is informed by movement. So to answer the question, it's like it can't be exhausted. The Black radical tradition can't be exhausted because it's not about, right, a set of figures or intellectuals, right? It's about movement. It's about masses. It's about the analysis, the critical analysis that emerges from below, right? So there's something about the idea of like thinking of the Black radical tradition as a kind of narrow, kind of scholastic project, kind of hems us into this idea that the radical tradition, can be exhausted by these thinkers. Like, and then it becomes like this whole kind of war and conflict among scholars who are like, oh, Robinson didn't say, he didn't mention this person, he didn't mention that person, right? That was not the point. That was never the point. And in fact, he says, right, the truer genius is among the people themselves. It was always derivative, always. Andrew, did you want to add anything?
I mean, the only thing I would add is, this gesture that Robinson makes regarding how a particular study does not exhaust its subject, but merely suggests that there's something there, which really serves as an invitation for further work. This is a quote from Robinson that we very deliberately reproduce in the introduction of our book, specifically to sort of indicate that this attempt to recover a critical theory of racial capitalism in King itself does not exhaust that subject, right? And to invite further work on King. And I say all on King's Critique of Capitalism, right? But I say all that to sort of preface a qualification here, which is, I think Jared and I both are, very sort of sympathetic to concerns that King, as a particular figure, there's been so much work done on King, right? I mean, do we need more work on King, right? Does more work on King, does the book we've written crowd out consideration of other figures? Could our energies have been spent over the last couple of years on doing something else to sort of lift up other aspects of the tradition, as opposed to sort of, I think we're sympathetic to those kinds of concerns. But to Jared's point, I mean, the frame of the Black radical tradition really asks us to think very differently about these questions of who, what is responsible for the ideas, the knowledge, the know-how that we try to recover from the historical record. So.
Okay, great. We're going to have one more question. I'm actually going to have it be one of my own because it was something I thought was important that we didn't get to. But I do want to just highlight in the chat that that's already in the chat is that the book is also free and open access online through the link that Professor Douglas posted. And so you can also buy the book if you want to, but just a reminder that you can start reading it right now if you want to go off and do that. So my last question is about worldmaking, which has come up and briefly, but I think there are books in political philosophy and political theory. I'm thinking Worldmaking After Empire by Edom Gadachew and The Rethinking Reparations by Olufemi Taiwo, that these are really sort of, that worldmaking has come back, if it was ever gone. But I think that there are lots of arguments about scales of politics, local politics, federal politics in the context of the United States, global politics, world-making politics, which are a specific way of thinking about more global politics, or politics on various scales. So can you talk a little bit about why, and particularly in the last chapter, world-making sort of comes out of comes into focus as a sort of as an important practice for those who want to sort of start thinking about these issues as problems of racial capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the sort of intellectual genealogy of the concept, the language of world making. I mean, I personally know it through Edom Gadachew's work. I haven't had a chance to read Olufemi Taiwo's new book. I really look forward to engaging that one. And Jared mentioned the work of LePaperson on A Third University is Possible, who uses this sort of language of world making. It's language that's sort of come before us, Jared and I, in the last few years, and much like the language and discourse and theory around racial capitalism, just seems to apply so nicely to efforts to reconstruct King's critical theory, right? I mean, from the last famous chapter to the last book he published during his lifetime, where do we go from here? The World House, to the Institute of the Black World, really trying to recover King's, and I mentioned earlier in the discussion, King is a dialectical thinker, thinking in terms of totalities and comprehensive wholes, as opposed to sort of parts in isolation, right? There's a certain worldly orientation that is important to recover, and that is so often missed when we sort of caricature King as a US-centric, sort of thinking only about domestic capitalism, for example, or domestic racism, apart from its sort of global context, which is, King was always interested in this inescapable network of mutuality. And even if, certain speeches or occasions, he seemed to indicate that he's sort of talking about a more local manifestation of a particular sort of complex set of issues, if you really read through all of the work, you see that behind it all is a worldly perspective. So that's one aspect of it that I think is useful. And to the point that Jared was making earlier in his response to the racial capitalism and Malcolm X questions about how, you can't get rid of racism without capitalism. You can't parse these things out, right? And if you have a kind of worldly sort of perspective, you see how it all hangs together. Mm-hmm. Right. And you see how there's a need to critique one world in order to bring about or build a new world. And that's a comprehensive project. It's not a piecemeal reformist kind of project. Ultimately, at the end of the day, despite the fact that piecemeal reforms may be useful. So I think all of that is important. And again, this language of world making has, like the language of racial capitalism, it just seems to resonate so well, even if it's language that King himself was not employing in that sort of technical sense of that concept. Mm-hmm. It's implicitly there, I think, in ways that we can tease out and reconstruct.
Yeah, I think that's right too. And I was also, when King. So a few things to say. So one is that when King talked about the beloved community, he often connected it to this idea of the world house, right? Building the world house. And even when King in the anti-war speech, the Vietnam anti-war speech, when he talks about the bringing about a revolution of values, that was in the context of kind of thinking about the way that sort of U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. had become the purveyor of violence around the world, right? Which is to say that if we're going to bring about, a kind of a revolution in which we come into a different relationality to each other, then we have to kind of think in these sort of global worldly terms, in just the way that Andrew was talking about. There's a the kind of there's a moniker on the left: think locally, think globally, act locally. That kind of applies here. And the other thing that I would say here too is that at the very end of that 5th chapter in the book, we talk about the importance of critique. A critique is essential to the kind of world-making spirit, and that critique sort of begins with one's own situatedness in the world around them, right? And then it's only in solidarity with other people, right? By kind of taking one's own kind of critical analysis, joining that, building power, building solidarity with other people, that the kind of world-making sort of spirit takes off. But I think Andrew is absolutely right about the necessity of a kind of the need to kind of think globally about these things, and it has something to do with the how massive the crises are, right? The kind of planetary crises of racial capitalism, right?
Yeah.
That require us to think in these sort of big terms.
And let me just add one thing to this. Insofar as we're thinking about this in the context of a Black radical tradition, Jared and I have done work on Du Bois, right? And this language of worlds, racial worlds, the white world, the Black world, by the 1930s, really, and we see this most prominently in Du Bois's 1940 Dusk of Dawn. He's sort of thinking in terms of what he calls the worlds of color and the worlds of race, right? Where the white world is an imperial project, capitalist, liberal individualist, market competitive, property institutions, violence, right? This all resonates with, for example, what Frantz Fanon sort of thinks about with sort of European man, right? What Sylvia Wynter is trying to think through. And the Black world is this sort of speculative other, right? That resonates with the beloved community in the context of King, certainly, right? In the context of Du Bois, cannot be reduced to the principles, values, practices of what Du Bois calls the white world, right? And so I think for Jared and I, certainly for myself, I don't want to speak too much about Jared's sort of reading and work on Du Bois, but certainly for my own work on Du Bois, which was the project for me that preceded this book, I was thinking in those terms. And so, when I came to King, finally, after all these years, finally coming to terms with King, again, having this language that Getachew and others sort of are using around world making, but also having this kind of Du Boisian white world, Black world framing. That was kind of the context that helped me anyway. I think both of us sort of see King in these terms, So I just wanted to add that.
Okay, wonderful. We are a little past time, so unfortunately I would have to say goodbye, but thank you so much to Professor Jared Loggins and Professor Andrew Douglas for joining us here today, and for the Andrea Mitchell Center for hosting us, and for all of you and your wonderful questions. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we will all see each other again. So with that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.